There was something I was reading this morning. Steve, I sent you a link to this this passage, or it was a write-up. It was called The Questions of Mary. Are you familiar with this? The Questions of Mary?
No, but I know Mary.
It's one of those links I text you.
Mary's another, that's a common Egyptian name that you find.
Yeah. Oh, this is it. The Lost Greater Questions of Mary. Can you zoom in on this a little bit? Yeah, this is crazy. So it says, this is Bart Ehrman's podcast, or not podcast, his website. There's a blog article on there where he's writing about this thing that happened with Jesus and Mary. And he said one of the great questions for scholars is whether such book ever really did exist, and it's mentioned only once in ancient literature in a highly charged polemical context by Epiphanius of Salamis, a Christian heresy hunter who was prone to exaggeration and fabrication, who was incautious at best in his attacks against heretical sects in his book, The Panarion, Medicine Chest. In it, Epiphanius supplies the antidotes for the snake bites of heresy. Wait, is this the one I said? Go scroll down. There was, keep going. Okay, here we go. For the Gnostic Philibinites, this text and their corresponding rituals related to their doctrinal views that humans represent divine sparks entrapped in human bodies which need to escape. Human procreation perpetuates the state of entrapment by providing an endless supply of bodies as prisons for the sparks of the divine. The solution to the problem, then, was to engage in non-procreative sex as shown to Mary Magdalene by the Savior himself. One odd night on a mountaintop, and here's the quotation for the text from Epiphanius. The first sentence, obviously, is Epiphanius himself explaining what the book is, which is called, okay, so the book is called The Greater Questions of Mary. They indicate that Jesus gave a revelation to Mary, taking her to the mountain as he prayed, and then extracted a woman from his side and began having sexual intercourse with her. Then he gathered his semen in his hand, explaining that this is what we must do in order to live. When Mary became disturbed and fell on the ground, he again raised her and said to her, "Why do you doubt, you of little faith?"
Wow.
Somehow I think this one never had much of a chance of getting into the New Testament.
Yeah. Well, he
was kind of a perv, man.
Yeah, there were a lot of Gnostic and apocryphal texts, that suggest all kinds of interesting things with Jesus and Mary, and others. I mean, some people believe, I happen to be under the opinion that, Timothy Freak covers this quite well in his books, The Jesus Mysteries, and also Jesus and the Goddess. I think
Timothy Freak.
Yeah, Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy. They did a number of good books. Mm-hmm. But one of the hypotheses is related to the Apostle Paul, that Paul, for the most part, he has these writings where he's speaking like a Gnostic, like he experiences Christ as a vision of light on the road to Damascus, right? Which is a very Gnostic thing. And it said he was taken up to the third heaven. Well, most people are like, know what heaven is, but what's the third heaven? And we know that Damascus was actually a code word used by the Essenes for their base in Qumran. And so it may suggest that Paul was an Essene, and that the third heaven, there were 3 levels of initiation or baptism that was designed to cleanse the person of all the bad stuff that they had attached to them as they incarnated into this world. So there's a baptism by water, there's a baptism by air, and then a baptism by fire. And And we find this going back way back into the ancient world. I mean, going back to Noah's Ark, in the story of Noah's Ark, grafted onto that story of the earth obsessed with its physical senses. Along comes a flood, water. Then Noah lets birds go into the air, and then he lands on Mount Ararat and makes a burnt sacrifice to God, fire, right? So those are the 3 stages of purification, if you will, which is done in the alchemical process, and it's but it was also used in the baptismal rites and the initiation rites in the ancient world. So, but with Paul, so the third heaven would be that he had gone through those 3 different purifications, right? Well, along comes a bishop known as Irenaeus, who wrote a book called Against the Heresies much later, where he was trying to condemn Gnosticism. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, at the same time, they discovered these new letters of Paul, where Paul is condemning Gnosticism. And the suggestion is that the church, in particular Irenaeus, created these letters of Paul specifically to justify suppressing Gnosticism, which was a rival perspective of Christianity than what the Roman Church was setting up at the time. And hence why Paul seems like this.
Paul's gospel was the closest one to Christ.
Well, it's supposedly Paul never actually knew Jesus, right, when he was alive,
right,
and yet the entire canon of the Roman Church was largely based off of Paul.
What was the closest gospel to Jesus? The first one published, or the first gospel?
Well, they say it's Matthew. They don't
okay.
really know for sure. I mean, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John,
right,
the standard gospels, and you have some of them are kind of similar, and then you have John, which is like totally out there and somewhat Gnostic in itself.
Yeah.
But
the closest one I thought was like 20 years after he died.
Well, yeah. I mean, they have found fragments, the Nag Hammadi fragments and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And all of these texts seem to point to source texts that, were within 100 years of after Jesus supposedly lived. But we don't know for sure. I mean, it's a guess.
Yeah.
Everyone's speculating. And,
There's a bunch of, I had a guy in here who's been studying the Dead Sea Scroll fragments his whole life, and apparently there's a huge black market for people trying to buy the fragments, and a ton of them are fake. And he actually discovered a bunch of the fakes.
I believe it. There's also been some that they haven't released them all. The ones that they found, they kind of gradually release them, and part of that's because, and every once in a while they get leaked. And as they come out, part of the reason why they don't release them is because they contradict modern theology. I mean,
right.
There's some great astrological information on some of them, for example,
Right. Another thing, and then they were mostly in Hebrew. I think if there was a very small percentage of them that were in Greek,
right,
and maybe some Aramaic. And the interesting thing about the Hebrew, going back to what we were talking about with the Septuagint being the original written in Greek,
right,
is that there was so much more Greek literature around in the Library of Alexandria. Everywhere was Greek. There's literally, I mean, we had the Dead Sea Scrolls during that time period that's in Hebrew.
Right.
There's nothing else in Hebrew.
Right.
That's it.
Right. That's right. And then the Nag Hammadi, some of those texts, I mean, they have some New Testament types of fragments, but they also have Hermetic texts, writings of Hermes that were right in there with them too, which suggests that this sect that was preserving this stuff was they saw them as compatible, and that's a whole nother can of worms that no one likes to talk about, But the Hermetic texts were.
How so? Why don't people like to talk about it? I think I'm missing something here.
Because Hermeticism was a pagan form of Gnosticism.
Oh, okay.
And it was, it was centered around Hermes, the Greek god Hermes.
Yeah.
And
what was the deal with Hermes again?
Well, Hermes was, he was he was deemed to be the inventor of the word. He created language. He was the messenger amongst the gods. He was he did a lot of work associated with talismans, how to bring energies from the stars down into and capture them in talismans here on planet. He was the inventor of alchemy, and he was in some ways the Hermetic texts could be read in almost a Neoplatonic way, suggesting that all reality. Well, one of the things that the Hermetic texts say is that all reality that we're perceiving is just mind stuff. It's the mind of the Creator. Like we're living in the mind of the Creator. And this matrix that we're in is in the mind of the Creator. And it seems solid and real to us. But just as the Creator's thoughts can change, so can matter change.
Those Greeks were bombed on drugs, dude.
Yeah, but it's right in line with what people like Maxwell Planck and Schrodinger and the other physicists of the early 20th century were saying too.
Totally.
This is all made up of mind stuff.
No, yeah, you're right about that.
So it's just the Greeks the Hermeticists were saying it thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So